others. As you described, the shooter earlier, Jose, a 15-year-old girl. We know that she died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound as she was being transported to the hospital. A handgun, was recovered at the scene. Shots were fired, we were told, in a classroom during study hall. There were students of all different grades at that time. There was a second grader who called in reporting the emergency, the active shooter. And then just 3 miles away, officials were actually training for this very event when this became a reality. But as far as the investigation goes, we know that there was a large law enforcement presence at the shooter's home yesterday. SWAT, local and federal agencies were on site. There was a point when a neighbor nearby heard flashbangs as authorities moved in and then got the all clear roughly 45 minutes later. Authorities are saying that the shooter's parents are cooperating. We know that the father was questioned extensively for several hours yesterday. But as far as the motive goes, it's still unclear at this point. There is a document that is circulating online that authorities are currently reviewing, but they're also looking at the shooter's digital footprint leading up to this shooting. So still a lot of questions, but once again, another update expected later on this afternoon. But as you can imagine, Jose, this community is still reeling from this tragedy, and a lot of resources are being pulled together to help those families who were affected. Jose?
Kathy Park, thank you so very much. Frank, so many questions here, and it's just something that's becoming all too common, unfortunately, in our country. And I'm just thinking, Frank, where do investigators go from here? It's particularly important, I think, that this person was currently, we believe, a student at that school. So, you know, when we're talking about hardening schools, et cetera, you know, how do you deal with a person who is currently a student? What are the questions that investigators have at this hour?
Yeah, so obviously, since the shooter is deceased, this is not about building a case for prosecution, but rather it's about answering the questions of why and how. So, for example, you mentioned the student's status as an active member of that school community. Did that play into this? I mean, she clearly chose to act out in the school. Why? Why that location? They'll be looking at whether there was bullying, whether there was an ongoing dispute with the school or this teacher or particular students. Did she shoot randomly, or did she target the people she was shooting in this small study hall environment? And, you know, some of that will be interviewing students, and that's easier said than done when you're talking about maybe a second grader, a 7-year-old who was a witness to this. You've got to have people trained in, you know, non-traumatically interviewing a 7-year-old who may have witnessed this horrible thing. The social media, the computer, the devices, all of this will be gone through. And of course, the question remains, where did she get the pistol? And we've heard kind of implications from the chief that maybe we should not assume that she got it from her parents, from the house. And if that's not true, then where? And so ATF is very expert at trying to track this. It's not easy, but trying to track that serial number literally from the manufacturer to the hands of this young lady.
Now, there are so many of these questions. I mean, you know, trying to determine a motive, and certainly if there is, as Kathy points out, although not confirmed yet, like document that this person may have written up. Those are important issues to look at, but I'm just wondering, you know, it's a 15-year-old with a handgun in school just a couple of days before the Christmas celebration break. It's normally there's a little bit of a pattern in these people that shows that they're going through some difficult times or issues. It's, you know, do you think the issue of red flags, was there any flag mentioned in this?
Indeed, because if we don't learn from these tragedies, then they're wasted on us if we don't get better at something. And I'm a strong advocate, Jose, of incorporating training in a school environment for not only faculty and counselors, but even in an age-appropriate way for fellow classmates to understand the warning signs and indicators that someone near them is on a pathway to violence. We've got to get better at that. And only way to do that is to learn from these episodes. So, yeah, give signs of this. And so what were the signs? And the FBI will at a threat assessment center based at Quantico, Virginia. They study all these types of shootings, and they'll be helping with, hey, that was leakage of a grievance right there, or that's where she said what sounded like I'm going to harm myself or others. They'll be looking at that. It's rare that there's no clues or indicators, particularly with a teenager.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of the Parkland shooting or even the Uvalde shooting. There were very many signs in the case of the Parkland shooter that he was having some issues. And, you know, police were called many times. They decided to not, act more aggressively that maybe because they couldn't because of the law. In the case of the Uvalde shooter, the 18-year-old, you know, there was some indication that he was deteriorating. I'm just wondering, it's so unusual, or is it not, that it's a 15-year-old girl in this case?
Oh, you're right if you think this is rare. It is. I mean, the studies show that we're talking low single digits, perhaps less than 5% of all school shootings over the last decade or two involve female shooters. So that's another thing that will cause the law enforcement specialists to really dig in and study this. And does this represent a trend? Are the numbers going up with regard to female shooters? Even when you go beyond the school environment, mass shootings generally in society, the number is still in the low single digits for female shooters.
Frank Figliuzzi, I thank you very much. And of course, we're thinking of the families that have been affected by this, people that lost their lives, the other young people that are clinging to life and fighting for life right now. Frank, thank you. I very much appreciate it.
Sure.
And turning now to breaking news out of Moscow, Ukraine this morning is taking responsibility for the killing of a Russian general, the head of Russia's chemical, radiological, and biological weapons in Moscow. This is video captured of the general and his aide walking out of a residential building. There you see that explosion. The bomb was remotely detonated. Just yesterday, a Ukrainian court charged this general, Igor Kirillov, with using banned weapons in Russia's war with Ukraine. Joining us now is NBC's Hala Gourani and Mark Polymeropoulos, former chief of operations in Europe and Eurasia at the CIA and an NBC News national security intelligence analyst. So, Hala, good morning. This is really kind of significant. What happened here?
Very significant. This is a very high-level officer in Moscow, and basically the Ukrainians have taken the war to the heart of the Russian capital with that remotely detonated bomb that was hidden, we understand, in a scooter. So Igor Kirillov, a 54-year-old, in fact, he was born in 1970, is the head of that unit that you mentioned there of weapons of mass destruction, of biological and nuclear warfare. And the Ukrainians are saying that essentially his unit participated in that Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and was responsible for causing a lot of damage and deaths inside of Ukraine, and that they considered, therefore, this lieutenant general to be a legitimate target. Now, we haven't had reaction from the Ministry of Defense, but we've had an outpouring of condolence messages from various politicians and agencies inside of Russia. As far as Ukraine is concerned, as I mentioned, Jose, they're saying this is a legitimate target. This is somebody who was deeply involved in the war effort inside of Ukraine after the invasion in 2022. It's a very bold move. This is something that is going to resonate with residents of Moscow and across Russia as well. We're not now talking about actions on the border areas, right outside of the Russian side of the border with Ukraine, but we're talking deep into the Russian state. And Ukrainians, of course, are all just in the next few weeks waiting for what will President-elect Donald Trump's the fact that he's going to be taking office soon, will it mean for U.S. support of the Ukrainian effort against Russia militarily as that war grinds on, Jose?
Hala Gourani, I thank you very much. So, Mark, and Hala was saying this was an extremely bold move. Indeed, it was. I mean, Ukrainian security service sources say that a scooter laced with explosives was detonated, killing these two people in the streets of Moscow. How did Ukraine pull this off, and how bold of a move was it?
So, Jose, Hala's right. This is an extraordinary operation. This is called a high-value target op. In essence, it's a find, fix, and finish mission. What is amazing is this entails the Ukrainians having recruited sources not only inside of Russia, inside of Moscow. That's an agent network. That's individuals who would carry out surveillance with a pattern of life of the target, who would then employ the explosive and then call the target out. And so that is really an extraordinary breach of what many consider a denied area. And this is going to be deeply embarrassing to Vladimir Putin, absolutely humiliating the Russian security services, because it shows that Ukraine has this reach, again, not just into Russia, but into the heart of Moscow and against high-value targets. Really an impressive operation, in my old, business. But something I think that will resonate very deeply within the Russian national security infrastructure.
And Mark, so the fact that it was essentially a glorified IED, I mean, that's essentially what this was, right? And even though what I think what makes it extremely significant is, as you say, it was in a denied area. What do you mean by a denied area? And how difficult is it to get something like an IED into a denied area?
Right. There's thousands of Russian security personnel in Moscow. Denied area means there is a pervasive, security state that watches everyone's moves, whether it's camera systems, whether it's informants. And for Western intelligence services and for the Ukrainians as well, this is an area that's very difficult to operate. So by recruiting sources inside who can operate there, that shows a level of penetration of Russian security that I think is something that is quite noteworthy. And again, as you noted, they actually have to not only observe the target, but they have to smuggle in the explosives. Then they have to detonate this. This apparently was detonated remotely in a scooter, but that means individuals on the ground. So I think there's going to be a very severe, counterintelligence operation by Russian security. The heads will roll as well. And then the last piece is we are going to see, as Hala noted, kind of there's been a ferocious reaction from the Russians. There will be some retaliation, probably, unfortunately, in the form of strikes in Ukraine against civilian targets.
And, what can Ukraine expect? Is it, Mark, that a retaliation of this magnitude would include more than just increased missile strikes on what they've unfortunately been doing for years now, which is destroying parts of the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine? But could it lead to maybe some targeting, pinpoint attacks on Ukrainian leaders?
So, the Russians have tried, but the Ukrainians, of course, their security services are very good. I think, no doubt, Vladimir Putin and his security apparatus would like to do this. They just have not been able to. So I think the default mechanism will be just kind of more mass casualty events against the Ukrainians. But let's also note one thing as well, is that the Ukrainians, have been very worried, of course, of the incoming Trump administration, what they're going to do about the kind of flagging European support. This operation will be celebrated inside of Ukraine. There's going to be some satisfaction there that they're still in the fight. And I think that psychological piece is going to be quite important.
So what does that tell you, if anything, of what was the NKVD, what was the Soviet system, and what has become the Russian interior control and monitoring system?
So, they're good, but maybe they're not that good. And that the Ukrainians are able to penetrate them is amazing. So this is the first, the most senior Russian military official, security official killed. The Ukrainians have struck before several years ago.